Elias Thorncroft came home from a 3-day energy conference to find his family's entire solar array reduced to twisted aluminum framing and shattered glass. A demolition crew's dumpster already hauling the wreckage away, and a citation notice zip-tied to what used to be his main inverter housing, citing an unauthorized structure violation he had never once been notified about. He didn't know it yet, but exactly 6 days later, Brambleton Hills' brand-new $2 million clubhouse. Mid-gala, mid-wedding reception, mid-everything the board had spent a year promoting, was going to go completely, catastrophically dark and stay that way for a full week. Stay with Elias as one reckless demolition unravels into the discovery that the HOA had been running its entire flagship building on power it never actually owned. Elias Thorncroft was 52 years old, a renewable energy engineer who had spent the last decade running a small solar consulting firm from the same 40-acre property. His father had homesteaded next to what later became Brambleton Hills. When the developer originally broke ground on the community's clubhouse 15 years earlier, extending a full utility substation connection out to that remote corner of the property would have cost well over $1 million the developer didn't want to spend. So Elias's father, a solar pioneer even before it was fashionable, offered an alternative. Elias's father built a dedicated solar array and battery storage system specifically sized to power the clubhouse, and signed a recorded interconnection and easement agreement with the developer. The array would serve as the clubhouse's primary electrical supply, permanently, in exchange for a small annual easement payment and a formal HOA fee waiver for the Thorncroft property, an arrangement that had quietly worked exactly as designed for 15 years, largely because almost no one still living in Brambleton Hills remembered or had ever been told that it existed. Priscilla Vane, 49, had been HOA president for barely 8 months when she first drove past the Thorncroft property and decided the rows of solar panels visible from the community's back entrance were dragging down the luxury aesthetic she'd been hired, essentially, to protect as a real estate consultant turned board president. She never once requested the property's recorded easement history from the county. She simply issued a citation, citing an unauthorized commercial-scale structure violation under a bylaw clause meant for actual businesses, not a dormant solar array quietly running a building she had no idea it powered. When Elias didn't respond to the citation within the absurdly short 5-day compliance window, because he was 3 states away at an industry conference with only intermittent phone service, Priscilla authorized an emergency abatement demolition under a clause meant for genuinely hazardous structures, sending a crew to tear out the panels, the inverters, and the battery bank entirely, all without ever consulting the HOA's own maintenance staff, several of whom knew exactly what that array actually did. Elias arrived home to the wreckage and immediately called the HOA office, expecting a simple, if infuriating, property dispute. Instead, he got a receptionist who transferred him to Priscilla directly, and Priscilla, still confident she'd solved an aesthetic problem, told him flatly that the board wasn't interested in relitigating a demolition that had already occurred, and that if he had a complaint, he could file it through the standard grievance process, a process that would take, by her own estimate, up to 90 days. Exactly 6 days after the demolition, during Brambleton Hills' long-planned anniversary gala, the event the board had spent an entire year and a significant chunk of the clubhouse's operating budget promoting. Every light in the building cut out simultaneously, mid-toast, plunging 200 guests, a live band, and a catering staff mid-service into total darkness. The clubhouse's diesel backup generator, which almost no one on the current board had ever personally inspected, failed to kick on entirely. Facilities staff scrambling in the dark discovered the generator hadn't been serviced in over 2 years, despite an annual maintenance line item that had been approved and paid out of the HOA budget every single year during that same period. With no working generator and, as facility staff would soon discover to their horror, no actual utility company connection to fall back on either, the clubhouse sat completely dark for the rest of the gala, the following morning's scheduled wedding reception, and every day after that for a full week, while board members scrambled to understand a question none of them could initially answer. How does a $2 million building not have a working connection to the power grid at all? The bride, whose reception had been canceled with less than 12 hours' notice, posted about it publicly, tagging the HOA's own social media account. And within a day, the story had been picked up by a local news outlet running the headline "Luxury HOA Clubhouse Goes Dark," and no one can explain why. Board members fielded furious calls from residents demanding refunds on catering deposits, event deposits, and the special assessment fees that had funded the clubhouse's construction in the first place. Desperate, the facilities manager called the regional utility company directly, requesting emergency service restoration, only to be told, after a confused pause on the other end of the line, that according to their own records, the clubhouse address had never been an active account. There was no meter. There was no line. There was nothing to restore because there had never been anything there to begin with, a fact that left the facilities manager sitting in his car outside the dark building, trying to figure out how to explain that to a board that had just spent a year telling residents this was the finest building the community had ever built. An emergency contractor called in to restore power discovered, buried in a stack of 15-year-old transition documents in the HOA's records room, the original interconnection agreement, plainly stating that the clubhouse's electrical service had never been connected to standard utility infrastructure at all, and had instead run entirely on the Thorncroft solar array since the day the building opened. Word spread through Brambleton Hills within hours, and residents who had paid thousands of dollars in special assessments toward the state-of-the-art clubhouse now learned the building had been running, this entire time, on a piece of infrastructure the board itself had just ordered demolished without ever checking what it actually did. Elias retained a property attorney named Renata Boyle, who requested the full board correspondence history and found something Priscilla clearly hadn't anticipated anyone would look for. A written memo from a former board member, filed 3 years earlier, explicitly warning any future board that the clubhouse's power supply depends entirely on the Thorncroft easement. Do not authorize any action against that property without first consulting the recorded agreement. The memo had been filed, read, and apparently forgotten, sitting untouched in the same records room the interconnection agreement had come from. Renata's investigation widened further when the facilities manager, under pressure to explain the generator's failure, admitted that the maintenance budget line item had been consistently approved by the board's treasurer, a man named Foster Higgins, but that no actual maintenance contractor had visited the site in over 2 years, raising an obvious question about where that approved budget had actually gone. Bank records Renata subpoenaed showed the maintenance payments had indeed been disbursed each year, but to a vendor name that, when Renata searched the state business registry, turned out to be a defunct entity with no active license, no listed employees, and an address that matched a residential property owned by Foster Higgins's brother-in-law. Digging into board meeting records, Renata found something Priscilla had never disclosed to the rest of the board. 3 months before the citation, she had quietly discussed with a parking expansion contractor the possibility of acquiring part of the Thorncroft property to double the clubhouse's event parking capacity, an expansion she believed Elias would only agree to if he were under enough pressure, legal, financial, or otherwise, to want to sell rather than fight. At an emergency HOA meeting packed with furious residents still without a functioning clubhouse, Renata laid out the full picture. The buried interconnection agreement, the ignored warning memo, Foster Higgins's unaccounted-for maintenance funds, and Priscilla's undisclosed parking expansion motive behind the citation in the first place. She projected the 15-year-old memo onto the wall of the very clubhouse it had warned about, its final line. Do not authorize any action against that property without first consulting the recorded agreement. Sitting in stark contrast to the darkened chandeliers hanging overhead, powered that evening entirely by rented portable generators wheeled in just for the meeting. The twist landed hardest when Renata revealed the financial reality nobody in the room had considered. Under the terms of the original recorded easement, unlawfully demolishing the array without cause triggered a liquidated damages clause requiring the HOA to pay the full replacement cost of the solar and battery system, plus a contractual penalty for every day the clubhouse went without power as a direct result, meaning the HOA, not Elias, was about to become the party owing an enormous sum of money. Priscilla, facing both the board's fury and Renata's documentation, attempted to argue the demolition had been a good-faith code enforcement action, an argument that collapsed the moment Renata produced the parking expansion correspondence showing Priscilla's actual motive predated the citation entirely. The board voted to remove Priscilla from the presidency immediately, and separately referred Foster Higgins's maintenance fund discrepancies to the county for a formal financial audit, which later confirmed nearly $85,000 diverted through the shell maintenance vendor over 2 years. Facing the easement's liquidated damages clause, breach of contract exposure, and mounting resident anger, the HOA settled with Elias for full replacement of the solar and battery system, compensation for the outage penalty period, and legal costs. A total settlement of $1,150,000, Funded through a special assessment, the board could no longer avoid explaining to residents in complete, uncomfortable detail. Foster Higgins was separately charged with embezzlement and ordered to make personal restitution for the diverted maintenance funds, on top of losing his position and facing a civil suit from the HOA itself. Elias, now working directly with the newly elected board and its facilities committee, rebuilt the array to modern specifications, larger and more efficient than the original, this time with a proper, independent HOA-funded backup connection to the actual utility grid. A redundancy Elias himself had recommended 15 years earlier and that had simply never been built because it had always been cheaper and easier to depend entirely on him. Months later, Elias stood at the edge of his property watching the new panels catch the late afternoon sun. The clubhouse visible in the distance, fully lit, hosting another event that was, this time, running on a system everyone finally understood. A young board member, part of the new leadership that had replaced Priscilla, walked over and asked him, half joking, whether he'd ever considered just letting the whole thing go dark permanently after everything that happened. Elias thought about it for a moment before answering that he never once wanted to punish anyone by taking something away. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, watching someone else try exactly that against him. What he wanted, he said, was simply for people to understand what they were depending on before they decided to tear it down. If you've ever had someone try to weaponize against you, leave a comment below. Tell me what happened. Tell me how it ended. And if you enjoyed the story, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.